I'm Dylan Ratigan. I've interviewed nearly every CEO and most world leaders during the past 25 years. And now I'm bootstrapping. I'm turning my attention to the new CEOs and the irrepressible entrepreneurs leading the next generation of innovation in the world. Welcome back to Tasty Live. I am Dylan Ratigan. Time for another episode of Bootstrapping. I'm proud to introduce an old friend and an old mentor of mine in a sense. Steve Koch was the head of mergers and acquisitions at Credit Suisse First Boston in the past, which is the context in which I met him. In the time since then, he's done many a thing, among them deputy mayor in Chicago. He's a true Chicago man, I guess I would say, and now is an investor and an advisor and an entrepreneur in his own right. And Steve, it's a pleasure to see you again after I think about 20 years. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, and good to see you.
Yeah. So I'm going to start, I guess, with what I perceive about your domain expertise, which revolves around the financial universe in general. And I'm interested in your perspective on, how do I say this? The market is behaving like it was behaving in my mind in '99 with AI now, right? Where it's almost undifferentiated, enthusiastic, all these things. Anyway, I'm interested in your perspective on this moment in the market, in the industrial shift that's represented by the AI and all the things that I'm sure you're well aware of, and how that compares to other innovative bursts and manias, and how you contextualize what's happening right now.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's an old saw, which turns out to be sort of the true, which is the more things change, the more they stay the same. I'd say what I have learned over the years is markets tend to be faddish. They do follow the crowd. Tends to be the madness of the crowd. That old book about market behavior is true. I think we're in one of those periods. That said, there is no question that we're in a fundamental shift in the way technology is going to affect humanity. I think we're in one of those moments where we're at a pivot point. That doesn't mean there won't be winners, there won't be losers. There will be companies and technologies that become dramatically even more valuable than they are today. And there will be people who profess to use those technologies and some aspects of those technologies that turn out not to be commercially successful. So all that's to say that we're in one of those moments where there really will be ways to profit. There will be stocks and investments that take advantage of this technological shift, that take advantage of new technologies, and people who choose the right ones will be enormously rewarded, and people who choose the wrong ones will suffer the consequences of having made wrong choices. I think we're in sort of one of those early stages where the boom seems to apply to everything equally. And then as you get into the middle and late stages of a cycle, it becomes much more differentiated and the real winners and losers emerge. I just don't think we're quite there yet. So it's a little hard to tell. I wish I was smart enough to actually follow my own view of the world and be able to discern winners and losers. I can't do that. I really can't. All I can observe is based on some history is that sort of that moment we're in.
Yeah. What is your perspective on the health of American governance, capital markets? In other words, do you feel like, I mean, because I know you do both board work and you do independent director work and all these types of things, all of us are pretty critical of the American political system, which we obviously won't get into in this discussion. But we also look to the corporate world as a world that is better at governance, at least when it's good at it. And I'm curious how you feel about the quality of governance, and sort of, is it improving? Is it deteriorating? How are we doing in terms of being custodians of our own resources?
Well, that is a complicated, loaded, and question you could take in a lot of directions. Here's one thing I would say, which is I have had the enormous luck and benefit of being able to spend some time in the corporate world, particularly focused in how capitalism governs itself and how public companies govern themselves and how that works. And equally, I was enormously lucky to spend some time in government, albeit in local government, but in US government. I think I had a perch to sort of observe how those two function. And I'd say, it's, if you had a penny, a dime, even anything for every time somebody says, oh, we should just run government like a business, that's an absurd statement. Government isn't business. Government is way harder. The advantage of business is it's pretty clear cut. Around the edges, there's a lot of debate, but fundamentally, business has to make a profit, return to capital, and then be able to grow. And it's relatively straightforward as to what your objectives are and how to achieve them. It's complicated to manage through that. People are complicated. I'd say people today are more complicated than ever to manage, but fundamentally business can be governed in a certain way. The complexity of government is just infinitely greater. There's way more stakeholders. There's way more constituencies that government has to address and respond to. So I think it's a little unfair to compare the two. I think, the American system of capitalism and of corporate governance is really extraordinarily effective. There's always worry around the edges, and you worry about where
But can we stop there for a second?
Sure.
What do you think are the distinguishing character? What are the first principles, I guess would be the word I'm looking for, of American corporate governance that make it perform as well as you described in general?
Well, Dylan, I have the disadvantage and advantage of a law background. So I'm a big believer in the rule of law and the certainty of the rule of law and the ability of investors to make decisions that are going to happen that affect things way in the future based on knowing the rule of law is going to govern those arrangements. And that's allowed the American capital system to use third-party capital. People regularly entrust their money to people they don't even know to use it effectively, and they know that the legal system will protect them. That's an enormous asset. That doesn't exist in most of the world. It exists in most of the developed world, but the American version of that may be one of the most evolved there is. And that's fueled the American economy in a way that nowhere else on earth enjoys quite to the same extent. The ability to bring third-party capital to apply to a business, to grow a business, to then provide all the benefits that business growth can generate is an enormously important asset that America has. And I think it's fundamentally based on the certainty and reliability of the American system, the American legal system, the rule of law that allows people to depend on that. That's a pretty extraordinary asset. You don't have developed public markets.
Tom Sosnoff would argue that that's the number one American asset is a combination of that of rule, I wouldn't say American asset, but the number one American business asset is combination of rule of law and depth of liquidity.
I'm not going to argue with whether it's 1, 2, or 3, but it's certainly one of the top assets. We have. I mean, we have extraordinary ingenuity. We have a tradition of applying academic innovation to business. There's a bunch of things, but that certainty of how you can bring third-party capital to grow business is an enormous asset, enormously important. If we ever lose that, woe betide us. It's a very important thing to protect, to nurture, to take very seriously. And I'm always nervous when you see people, there's some public figures attacking that today. You have to worry about where that leads. But, it's been a very resilient system. And it's one that has fueled a lot of wealth creation, a lot of benefit, a lot of social innovation, a lot of social benefit.
and it's as healthy today as it's ever been.
I, I I think it's very healthy as to what,
Yeah, it's
as
plenty
healthy
healthy.
as
It's
ever. Who
perfectly
knows?
healthy.
It's
Yeah, but
always
it's
under
perfectly
attack.
healthy.
There are
Right.
always people seeking to sort of circumvent it, seeking to game it. And one of the extraordinary things, the resilience of that system, is how it resists being gamed, how people lose when they try to game it.
Mm-hmm.
But you always have to worry about it. It's
Mm.
it's not something that happens on its own. There are a lot of extraordinarily dedicated, brilliant people who devote their lives to making sure that system works well.
Um, I want to switch to your M&A hat, if I might, for a moment,
Sure.
in a sort of through the lens of the gigantic technology companies. And, you know, going back to when I was a financial journalist, and I think it was around the same time you were working as an investment banker, Microsoft was the bullseye for antitrust, and they're too big and all these things.
Yeah.
And now we have a variety of companies. We all know who they are, whether it's Google or Meta or on and on, that are enormous and have a lot of advantage from their size. But I'm curious what your perspective is on what the role, what is the, how do you manage for size and capitalism and in the context of um, monopoly? Which again, I'm not even saying these companies are monopolies, but moving in the direction of disproportionate advantage through size.
Yeah. Well, I think, sorry, I think I am fundamentally a believer in, I'm fundamentally a deep believer in antitrust law. Fundamentally a deep believer. I was educated at sort of home of the School of Economic Analysis of Law, which fundamentally started with respect to antitrust law, and even with sort of that free market kind of background, you still have to respect the value of limits of size. There are situations where capital tends to like a monopoly. Monopolies tend to get higher returns. And one of the roles of the legal system is to push back against that and to limit that. You can see today two or three things that have to bring you concern if you, like me, believe that society is better off with sort of some limitations on power, and particularly on economic power. If you look at the stock market performance, the US equity market performance of last year, which was enormously driven by 7 stocks, some of which are pretty volatile, you have to be concerned about what that means for the system as a whole. If you look at the way that modern technologies can take advantage of scale, almost to the disadvantage of consumers, you have to be concerned about that. If you look at the centralization of data and centralization of private information, you have to be a little concerned about that. So I think there is real value in thinking about how antitrust law, which is this juncture is over 100 years old. The tradition of antitrust law is really quite old in America, needs an updating. It needs a functional political system which could bring about some innovation and thought about what's the best way to apply those principles of antitrust law to the modern technology environment. I don't think we're there. I think it's too much and probably doesn't work to ask the court system to figure that out. I would say this is a job for Congress if Congress were not massively dysfunctional at the current moment. But being an optimist, I do tend to believe there will be some way to figure that out over the next few years. And that's very important. And I think that I would worry about unchecked and unfettered market power of big tech companies and how it affects society.
I agree with you, which is obviously why I asked the question. The
Right.
thing when I think about it, and I think through the traditional sort of the Standard Oil, template, or even the regional bell operating companies and all that sort of stuff, where basically the thing is we'll just take it and take one big company and make 10 smaller companies. But as we all know, the entire utility for the consumer, not just for the owner, but for the consumer on the technology side, is based on the everybody being on the same network, right? You and I get better
Right.
information
Right.
from
Right.
wherever it is
Right.
because it's a giant machine, right? The algorithm's better, you get better information.
Right.
And so, so having 10 small algorithms with shallow pools of information doesn't help anybody.
Right.
At the same, so I'm sort of, I'm like, how do you basically do it synthetically where you allow
It,
it, you know?
it's a fascinating question. We're not going to answer it here. I think the important thing to recognize is applying those core principles of antitrust, of the limits on economic power that antitrust law is about. Applying that to modern technology is very different than applying it to, say, control of a natural resource or to the marketing of a product. It's a different application. It requires some real nuance. And actually, to go back to a question a minute ago of how our system is working, I think one of the things that you have to be concerned about is our political system today does not do well with nuance, does not do well with complexity, does not do well with difficult, complicated, technological issues. And I think that's something we really have to think about how we improve upon. And, I'm a cranky old guy. I'd like to see government improve and to see people think about how to bring that about. That's really the question. You're asking the right issues. I'll begin to know how to solve them. What I do know is the historic application of those principles doesn't work precisely well right now.
But just because the historic application of the principles doesn't work particularly well right now doesn't mean that economic size and power is not an issue that needs to be addressed. Even it's just different. We need a new toolkit, basically, which you and I may not have. But
right, we really need to think about what new tools are going to effectively do what we're trying to do, and to serve the interest of the majority as opposed to serve particular special interests. And that's not a moment. I sit here in the U.S. and you look at the election results of last night and you say, boy, we're moving to extremes, not to the middle.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I guess where I would disagree with you, and the only reason I would disagree is because
you're going to disagree with me, Dylan.
Well, the number of political participants has dropped so low. So I believe that we misperceive we have empowered 5% of the country on any side to overrepresent their voice, and they are those who nominate the directors, those who nominate control, right? In other words, I don't have to explain to you. And so the nomination process is controlled by the extremes, which then creates the perception of the increase in extremism in America. I actually see it as an alienation from the extremism that has led to a disengagement, empowering those who remain, who are the only people who stay engaged are the more extreme. Anyway, I feel like that the American people get a bad rap, where I don't think the American people are extreme in general. I think that the political system is broken personally, and the only doors that are open are those for the extremes, basically. And what I mean is the primary.
I think that's the evidence would suggest you're right. I had the exact a similar feeling. I'm sitting watching the election returns last night, and with enormous fanfare, CNN or Fox or MSNBC, take your pick, are announcing the winner of the, I don't know, XYZ primary, and some state, and you look at the number of actual votes, it's like 50,000 votes, 75,000 votes, less than 100,000. Yeah. It's like some mind-bogglingly small number, and you equate that to, oh my God, some little dinky town in the middle of nowhere is deciding the next, potentially is certainly deciding the nominee of a major party, and therefore potentially the president of the United States. And yes, you're right. So it is this problem of very small numbers. I think if I talk to, people in their 30s, my kids' friends, they're alienated because they believe there isn't room in the center. I would say that's partly the system, but it's partly a failure of leadership. It's partly a failure of people. There is a path I actually believe there is path in the middle if people want to pursue it, and if leaders step forward and say, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you have these small numbers on the left extreme, you have these small numbers on the right extreme, and left and right extreme, and there is a real path in the middle, and there is, but it takes somebody to actually go after that and sell those ideas, and that's what's actually not happening right now that you would like to see.
I'm optimistic. I like that you're optimistic. I like that you're happy and healthy. I'm happy and healthy. I was so delighted. I don't even remember. There was some entrepreneur who came on this show. It sounds ridiculous because I remember being very impressed by him, but I don't remember his name. And he's like, "Oh, Steve's an advisor. Do you know who I'm talking about?"
No, I remember somebody connected us
Yeah,
recently
and he was
after a
very
long period
talented.
of
He's
time.
very charismatic. He deserves to be remembered.
Yeah,
Anyway,
whoever it was, but I'm glad they connected us. I'm
great.
glad that he reminded me that we hadn't seen each other in a long time, and it's great to catch up.
Yeah.
And look, I think being an optimist is a natural human condition. I actually think most humans, by definition, you have to be an optimist.
Yeah.
And I think it's an enormously useful way to go through life. I am a deep believer in the fact that the world will be better in the future than it is today. And, it's probably now more important than ever to believe that, to act upon that, and to live your life that way. So, pretty healthy. The alternative is, I've always puzzled, like, it can't be much fun to live that way.
I can't imagine. I've read studies where they say it's like a genetic thing too. Like there's an aspect where there's a genetic
Yeah, there's some of that.
but
Right.
anyway, those are beautiful words. I'm going to leave it there, Steve. Thank you for the time today.
It's a pleasure to see you.
You as well.
All right.
Steve
Talk to you
Koch,
soon.
thank you. Investor, entrepreneur, former deputy mayor, former head of M&A. I am Dylan Ratigan. This is Bootstrapping. You're watching Tasty Live, and we're back after this.